So our first session is titled The Fragile Present and Evaporating Near Future of Time-Based Media. I love it, such a daunting title. And our speaker is Ben Fino-Radin, who is a New York-based media archaeologist, I didn't know that about you, archivist and conservator of born digital and computer-based works of contemporary art. So his research areas include digital preservation, digital cultural heritage, web-based creative communities, computer history, information architecture, metadata, and animated GIFs. He's the founder of Small Data Industries, which is a consultancy providing services to support the collection, exhibition, and preservation and storage of new media art. He's worked with numerous institutions, and he was a time-based media art conservator at MOMA and the New Museum. And I had the pleasure of meeting Ben for the first time in 2017 when I was lucky enough to secure a place at the MOMA time-based media workshops. And he led a bunch of really significant sessions. So it's great to have him here today speaking to us. So I'll let Ben take over.
Thank you, Asti, for that wonderful introduction. So I thought really long and hard about what I wanted to talk about today with you all. I could tell you tales of heroism in rescuing artworks from aging and crumbling technologies. I could tell you about the international emerging discipline of time-based media conservation, or I could tell you about some of the exciting research that my team back in New York is working on. Rather than any of these, however, I decided I would focus on something much more fundamental, something that some of you may think has nothing to do with technology. And I will begin with a question. Who can tell me what the symbol means? I'm not going to call on you. How about this one? Well, they both mean the same thing. The pink rectangle and the inverted blue triangle are both pre-standardization versions of the Biohazard symbol. And if any of you are podcast fans and listen to 99% Invisible, this will be a little bit of review, so pardon me. But the research and design criteria that eventually went into the creation of universal symbols, such as this symbol, as well as the nuclear radiation symbol, it's quite astounding. People who are much smarter than me have spent decades considering what makes a symbol uniquely recognizable and universal across languages and cultural barriers. It gets truly interesting, though, when researchers have considered how these symbols may fail when we consider the timescale of 100,000 years. In Michael Madsen's 2005 documentary, Into Eternity, these issues are explored in considering how to warn future inhabitants of planet Earth 100,000 years from now about a nuclear waste site in the bedrock of Finland. These inhabitants, we won't even necessarily call them humans, these creatures, won't have the same symbols or culture as us today. And as a solution, designers proposed landscapes and architectural elements designed to elicit a feeling rather than convey a detailed message. And in 1984, a linguist in the German Journal of Semiotics proposed the creation of what he called an atomic priesthood, where an exclusive political group would use its own rituals and mythology to preserve this knowledge of radioactive areas. So if the mere cultural preservation of something so basic as a single symbol or something so simple as this dangerous thing is here is difficult, then how can we possibly hope to stand a chance when understanding something so obscure, for instance, as the numerous magnetic media encoding schemas that have been used over the course of computational history. Well, thankfully, when considering the conservation of works of art, we are not tasked with infinity. After all, the oldest institution in the USA to even collect time-based media art is itself barely 150 years old. And most responsible conservators would consider their mandate to be the life of their institution plus, maybe a few decades. Nonetheless, our work is made difficult by the fact that we cannot merely arrest the aging of materials. We are tasked with the stewardship of works of art that employ complex technological contraptions that fall apart and cease to work rather rapidly. This field of time-based media conservation accepts that change is inevitable and that our jobs as conservators has become to, quote, manage decisions about acceptable change, as Pip Lawrenson would put it. Yet, it is, again, inescapable that these artworks rely upon aging materials and technological products intertwined with the march of capitalism and innovation. From analog tools such as this cathode ray tube to the born digital artifacts that tell the stories of the history of interaction design, and contemporary forms that are challenging to maintain from the day they are created. Even if we can assume our ability to maintain the functionality of these technologies and the artistic legacies that depend upon them, even if we can do that, even if we can get this working for a long time, hundreds of years, we are then forced to face the more difficult challenge, the loss of knowledge. And to illustrate this, I would ask you, who among you, if given this interface, would know what to do? 3 people. I rest my case. For access to this sort of knowledge, the field of time-based media conservation is reliant on a collection of individuals, the high priests of obsolete technology, the keepers of the knowledge. And it is my pleasure to introduce you today to some of these individuals. And of course, the caveat I must give is that this list of individuals will show my bias and context as somebody who lives in North America, although they are truly global in their demand. C.T. Louis, an absolute master of the maintenance, repair, and care of the cathode ray tube, who started CTL Electronics in New York in Soho in the early 70s, and artists simply flocked to his TV repair shop because he had the latest, greatest technology. So C.T. Louis wound up working with artists such as Namjoon Paik, Shigeko Kubota very early on, and today museums all over the world depend on his expertise. Kurt Sadler, the owner of Dottronics, who back in the day were manufacturing cathode ray tube monitors, today still producing the electronics and repairing the PC boards that these TVs are reliant upon and providing museum quality calibrated monitors for exhibition purposes. Maurice Schechter, an absolute guru when it comes to the preservation of analog media. Another wizard of the analog arts, George Blood, based in Philadelphia. And this man some of you may recognize who came to speak here, Jason Scott, a complete expert on all things Apple II, which is the obscure interface that you saw before. Trammell Hudson, a hacker and firmware engineer and just absolute expert that my team has relied very heavily upon, as well as MOMA has relied heavily upon. Ian Finder, aka Tron, as he's known on IRC chat, which is where we found him, who is truly the world's expert in the preservation of the Grid Compass laptop computer, widely recognized as the first laptop computer and seen here in the collection of the Cooper Hewitt Smithsonian Design Museum. So I hope this illustrates that what we have at hand is not a technology problem, but a knowledge problem. How can we pass down the skills and the knowledge of these individuals so that it lasts longer than they do? Because I don't know if you noticed, but generally speaking, they're all more or less about as old as the technologies that they steward. So first, let's look at how knowledge is being presently disseminated throughout the field. So at New York University in the Institute of Fine Arts, the Conservation Center there has recently launched a new focus in time-based media conservation. So they are training a new generation of conservators trained in time-based media. It's not exactly the first thing of its kind in the US. There have been programs like the Moving Image Archiving and Preservation Program, also at NYU, that have really carried the torch for years. But this is the first conservation program with this focus. Efforts to capture very, very detailed knowledge and publish it, such as the book that was published by Mona Jimenez, Kathy High, and Sherry Hawking to document the incredibly important analog video synthesis tools that were created and used at the Experimental Television Center. Training workshops such as Tech Focus, a training workshop series held by the American Institute for Conservation of Historic Works of Art, wherein each iteration of Tech Focus focuses on a different particular medium. And what you see here is myself and my co-instructors training about 100 traditionally trained conservators on how to use the command line in Linux, how to create their own digital artworks and processing, and how to track their changes using Git. Visual demonstrations, such as we see here at the Media in Transition conference at the Tate in 2015, where attendees of the conference had the opportunity to see firsthand the variability in display equipment when using, say, a film projector side by side with a CRT projector and LCD and DLP projector, visually illustrating to the conservators and building a true connoisseurship of these subtle variations. And of course, as Asti mentioned, and you can see her in the right there, different haircut, the Mellen workshops at the Museum of Modern Art, which are intended to retrain mid-career professionals who perhaps didn't originally train in time-based media conservation, but they are at an institution where they are the person who has just become responsible for dealing with these new problems, and perhaps Asti is the exception, being a time-based media conservator. There are many institutions that will never be able to hire a conservator dedicated solely to this medium. So many of the conservators you see here are paintings conservators, sculpture conservators, paper conservators. But as great as all of these initiatives are, I would argue they're not enough. We cannot rely solely upon this elite priesthood of ancient technicians and officially ordained conservators. How might we adopt a model of knowledge distribution that is more sustainable? What would this look like? One of director Michael Madsen's conclusions in his documentary was that if we cannot rely on symbols, markers, or even archives to endure hundreds of thousands of years, that perhaps the most enduring form of passing this knowledge down would instead be through legends, passed on from generation to generation, that the nuclear waste site should be left unmarked, and that generation after generation should pass the commitment to forget down to one another. After all, stories that we tell each other, myths, religions, legends, these are forms of human knowledge that have traveled the furthest throughout history, much further than recorded history. Perhaps our field could borrow from this model. It isn't that the current model of this priesthood or professional guilds, this centralized model of knowledge, is inherently bad, but perhaps it can be bolstered by a form of technological cultural stewardship that re-engages the general public with the technologies of the past. A way of putting these keepers of the knowledge in direct contact with people other than the small circles of conservators, so that their knowledge can become something that is passed down outside the walls of the institution. And I think that as ACMI's efforts in this sphere ramp up, they are incredibly well positioned to not only engage their community and begin to find the local ecosystem of these experts and technicians, but to establish, a bidirectional relationship with their public, passing down these myths and legends and expertise of these materials and methods. After all, yes, we need experts and rigorously trained conservators in order for this to work. But just maybe the kid who comes in to play video games, but then just happens to learn how to handle film or how to repair a CRT monitor, just maybe he'll be the one or she'll be the one to pass this knowledge on down to the next generation. And it certainly couldn't hurt. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ben. So we're just going to start with maybe just a little discussion, and I have a few burning questions, and then we'll throw it out to the rest of you guys. So thanks for the image of maybe like 3 haircuts ago. So one thing I just wanted to comment on before I sort of start hitting you with the big hard questions is, one thing with the MOMA workshop that I thought was particularly successful was in the application process, what they asked for was a team. They wanted 2 people to come, and that 2 people, they wanted to be cross-departmental. My reason I think that was really significant is because they didn't just want the objects conservator or that conservator headspace, but they wanted the curator of international art or the collections registrar or like the Uber AV tech to come. And I thought, just based on what we've been doing at the Art Gallery of New South Wales and building up this like slow, arduous coalition of support, that was perhaps the most significant sort of first step. This acknowledgement that you need a cross-departmental team, that you need different people coming at it from different headspaces in order to make traction. Mm-hmm. So yeah, that was just that. Just throw that one in there.
Yeah, well, that was incredibly intentional. So I'm on even though I'm not at MOMA anymore, I'm on the workshop planning committee. And before applications were even considered in making the cut, and I don't know how detailed you had to get into your institution's application process, but it required support from the director. So institutions that were really thoroughly, from top to bottom, committed to, this is a form of artwork that we are collecting and that we are going to continue to collect. That was the first requirement. And then the thing that you're talking about there, that's also about showing the institutional commitment and building in sustainability, because we just knew that if we trained a bunch of conservators and sent them back to their institutions, it was going to be the same situation that they found themselves in before. Maybe they had some more information and some more training, but no advocacy. Whereas when you have 2 people that come back to your institution and they're telling the director, hey, we need to do this, it's much more likely that they'll be heard.
Yeah, completely. And I think the last note on that, one of the big takeaways was the last session of that MOMA workshop. We were given, the 2-minute elevator pitch, which I think the Australian version of that is it's the 2-minute coffee line. And, okay, you're hit with here's the money guy, here's your director, here's your head of collections. How do you sell it, this kind of a project, in 2 minutes? And I think that I often now think whenever I'm advocating for whatever small little change that I want to happen, I go to that same, okay, so you're in a coffee line and you've got 2 minutes. How do you make this sexy? Mm-hmm. So, that was an incredible experience. So, back to your ideas of the keepers of knowledge. I loved this idea, and sort of the notion of transference and sharing and passing along knowledge is integral to the survival of these artworks, and sort of the responsibility that we have as custodians of objects. So what I noticed through my various visits is you've got, in your New York bubble, I guess, you have this collaborative sharing. Well, it seems to me as an outsider quite down, between the Guggenheim, the Whitney, MoMA, and then to a wider extent, SF MoMA, the Tate. It seems like there are a bunch of formal partnerships and informal personal relationships that have really molded and supported each other along the way. So I guess being from the bottom of the world and just really getting started, my question is, what was the most, what has been the most successful in forming these kinds of relationships, and how can Australian institutions create a similarly successful network?
I mean, I think realizing the severity of the problem of conserving these kinds of works is really where it all started. And none of those institutional collaborations really, I think, would be where they are today if it wasn't for Richard and Pamela Kramlich, private collectors who started collecting time-based media art in the 90s, and they established the New Art Trust, which is what created Matters of Media Art, which is what created the collaboration that you're talking about between the Tate MoMA and SF MoMA. And I think that the way that project was shaped was successful because it began with everyone from the institution. So it obviously, creating a trust between these institutions and these private collectors began at the director level, but the first Matters of Media Art meetings, it included, and I'm just speaking about history because I wasn't there for the first ones, it was a long time ago, but directors of IT council, the directors, the chiefs of conservation, AV technicians, everyone at the same table. And that's where it started, but then I think it's long-term success in terms of continuing to publish recommendations and guidelines. I think that was successful more because there was a very small collaborative team from the institutions, no more than 5 people, responsible for actually articulating the outcomes of the project. But I think that what those projects haven't succeeded in is what I'm talking about here, and that's that it's all about establishing shared best practice within institutions, and so much of that is reliant on these people that I'm talking about here. So it's taking the knowledge from them, internalizing it, and continuing to have a relationship with them. But I think, again, for this to really be sustainable, it has to go beyond that. There has to be a way of the museums taking that knowledge and sharing it with anyone who's interested. And this media preservation lab that's going to be having at ACMI, I don't know if I'm allowed to say this, but it's going to be in the gift shop, or where the gift shop is currently, which is so prominent. And I think that that's an incredible statement. It's going to be one of the first things that the public sees when they walk in through, the Federal Square entrance. So, yeah, I mean, not to ACMI's horn too much, but I think it's going to be a really successful model.
And I think that's really, that's great to know, because one of my points I took out of your talk was that, okay, we get that change is inevitable, but what's our role within the community as someone who understands this to communicate that and advocate for it? And I mean, I'm sure I'm not alone in this room when you've told the scary disaster story and the response has been, well, we just won't collect that kind of art. And, so there's this fear that you're walking this very fine line between needing to find a language to communicate the very real, very now issues of obsolescence, but also still want people to be passionate about the thing that you love. Mm-hmm. I don't know.
It comes down to audience. It's who are you talking to? Because if you're talking to your director, you can't just tell the horror stories. And what I've found, now running a business that's helping a lot of institutions kind of like go through this growing phase of internalizing this kind of expertise, what we found is really successful is small kind of pilot projects, things that are digestible enough that, maybe even they don't even need to get the cost approved at the highest level. So it's something they can kind of do like a little bit under the radar and then come to the director with this like great success story where it does show the severe risks and the challenges, but it also shows like what they need to be doing and an example of that, and showing that it's something that they can do internally.
And what kind of patterns have you found evident with your consultancy, like going to sort of smaller institutions where I'm sure they've asked, for a myriad of help from, policy and planning down to digital infrastructure. Have you found that there's been a pattern of, institutions seem to make the same mistake, or they seem to be asking you for the same thing? Have you found that there's always one thing you're saying at the beginning that is repetition?
Yeah. I mean, storage is always one of the hardest problems for institutions in terms, because digital preservation best practices say 3 copies in 3 locations and fixity checks and all this stuff. And that's not easy. So it's hard to know where to start for institutions. But what I also see outside institutions with private collections, private collectors are really frustrated right now because they're to even just collect time-based media art and not have it be, dysfunctional in 3 years. They basically have to invest in conservation at like museum levels of effort. And most collectors who are collecting time-based media are fine with this because they are, true passionate connoisseurs and collectors. They're not just doing it for an investment or something like that. So they're happy to do this. But the way that conservation works is so secretive and centralized, and they feel that, especially when it comes to time-based media, it's a bit obtuse and they don't really understand what it is that the conservator is doing. I mean, not when they work with us, because we really do a good job of communicating. But so what I've seen is private collectors are beginning to collaborate, and that's really exciting because they see that, wait, like I'm paying a conservator to condition assess this artwork that I know this other collector just collected, and it's digital, so it's just and it's probably the same file. So like, why are we both paying 2 different conservators who also probably aren't even talking to each other? So that's really exciting.
That's great to know, because I guess from and I may just have a very insular view at the moment, is what I'm finding at my institution is that as we're approaching this end of magnetic tape, 90s computer generated artworks are sort of starting to shut down and break. We're getting a lot of gifts. We're getting a lot of, because we're just this very beautiful idea from a collector with, I love this thing, I can't afford and I don't understand how to keep it working, so I'm going to give it to you because you can ensure its survival. And then from an institutional standpoint, feeling like, oh dear God, like, can we? So I really do like this idea of collectors actually sort of working together and sharing, and sort of, again, coming back to your, basic point of your talk is building a community where it's not secretive technical knowledge and skills that can keep this object alive, that it's very open source, I guess, for lack of a better term.
Yeah, or at least peer reviewed.
Yeah.
Not relying on a sole genius. Yeah.
Yeah, I had to wear that bad genius shirt at the Genius Bar at Apple there for 18 months. And I tell you what, just ask any businessman from Martin Place to just come at a 25-year-old female wearing a shirt that says genius. It's horrible.
I can't tell you how many time-based media conservators, especially like of our younger generation, that have started working in like some kind of like help desk scenario or like,
and I actually,
it's interesting.
And it's actually awesome, because the first thing they taught you at Apple is, oh, you don't need to know the answers to everything. You don't need to be a genius. So the term is, I don't know, let's find out. And I still use that now. I go into a situation, I'm like, brilliant. I don't know, but I will find out. And I think it's really become, for me, quite a mantra.
That's exactly the correct mantra for time-based media conservation, because no conservator can have the answer, because these keepers of the knowledge are the people that generally have these answers, because it requires a lifelong relationship with these various media. So collaboration is key. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, on that note, I think we've talked enough. Let's open it up to the audience. Does anyone have any questions?
Thank you. I'm an old school mainstream audiovisual archivist, mostly working in film, in video. My community works through FIAF, the television Fiat. I'm a member of the American Moving Image, AMIA. One thing when I hear discourses about time-based media preservation, I feel a little bit troubled. It's a subculture that seems to often talk and speak apart from what I know in mainstream audiovisual conservation. Yet so often I hear things that, particularly with the growing convergence between your practices and your subculture and what's going on in mainstream audiovisual preservation, and then you're talking about not enough people to carry the flame and carry the experience, and knowing a younger generation of mainstream archivists or even older mentors like Jim Linda or Reto Chroma.
Mm-hmm.
I'm wondering, is one of the answers is to get more involved in AMIA, or in fact, am I speaking, dinosaur speak, in the sense that you have reached out to those communities and we've let you down, and that's why you're developing a distinct curatorial and preservation practice around time-based media?
No, I think that film's actually one of the big exceptions, actually, because it was such a popular culture thing that, and there are, other cultures of professional preservation communities. I worry less about film, and you'll notice that the people that I showed, like, none of them were really like cut and dry film people. I worry less about that because, there are people who learn film preservation, like, rigorously, who don't work in art conservation, who, work in these allied disciplines, and there's quite a few of them. You could probably speak better to whether or not that's becoming a lost art than I could, but
like Mark Toscano at Academy Film Archive is a master of preserving experimental motion picture film.
Yeah.
And has curatorial frameworks for some of this, which are not distinct from what you're doing.
Yeah. It's really when it comes to like the magnetic media, like with starting with video and then getting into like floppy disks, hard drives, computer technologies, that's where I really get worried. With the analog media, you still kind of have, in communities like AMIA and other international associations, people learning this kind of magnetic media preservation, but it's still not at the level of the real experts. And then when you get into the born digital formats, those communities just don't really exist. I mean, kind of they do, but not intertwined with our professional community. And the dynamic with, say, like I think even the words we use to describe these communities is problematic. We call them hobbyists. Why? Just because they don't have a degree. But, for instance, like vintage computing enthusiasts, like the Carnegie Mellen Computers Club, they're incredibly vital. But the way that our profession, I think, relies on them is very, we need your expert knowledge. We're going to learn some of this and collaborate with you, but thank you very much and goodbye. And so, what I would like to see is more like taking that and spreading it, giving these people a platform. I can't tell you how often it's like, can we, where can we find like a hacker, like some kind of like techie nerd person who can solve this problem? And it's just so blatantly obvious to me that like, conservation is just so not connected to those communities in a meaningful way, where there's, I think, a real meaningful mutual respect, but also an interest in establishing some kind of more sustainable relationship.
Can you tell me what your attitude is about transposing an artwork from one technology medium to another? Does that in any way undermine the integrity of the artwork?
It certainly can. But, it's essentially inevitable. All technologies break down, die, even if you stockpile original dedicated equipment, there comes a time when you have to move on. Obviously, any kind of conservation treatment or intervention is done in consideration of the artist's intent. Especially, in the U.S., we have case law that dictates that any kind of conservation intervention cannot damage the integrity of an artwork, because if it does, the artist can renounce it. This is the Visual Artists' Rights Act. There hasn't been a case of this happening in time-based media yet that I'm aware of. It's happened mostly in installation art and prints. There's 2 lawsuits that happened involving the artist Candy Nolan, for example. So in consideration of the integrity of the work, the artist's intent, that kind of moving of technologies forward has to happen. But the way that I like to think of it is there's kind of 3 layers to an artwork. You can think of it, as at the top layer you have the work, the intellectual idea that is the artwork. That can never change, obviously, and this is where perception happens. And then below that, you have kind of like the technological anatomy of how it works, like the basic, there's a computer that does this thing, and there's a sensor, and it does this thing. That can change sometimes if it has to, but beneath that you have kind of like the real implementation level. It's like this is the source code, this is how it was programmed, this is the kind of sensor, this is the kind of computer. That's the part that will always have to change. There's no way around that, unless the artwork has to just die. Sometimes you can change the second layer, but you never change the top layer.
So I guess in this sense, is it really on the collecting institution to be aware of what the object is, to its core in terms of artistic intent when the work's acquired? I always think of the example of, Bruce Nauman and his films, and the fact that he wants these shown on 16mm film with a 16mm projector. But Nam June Pak, he both in his lifetime and with his artists has stayed very open to the ideas of reconstruction and reinterpretation. So really, does it come down to these institutions to ask that question rather than sort of shoot straight to the technical data?
Yeah, it's never just technical. It's a collaborative decision-making process that has to involve the artist or artist estate. Not always immediately. It's good to kind of come to them with some kind of understanding of what's possible and what's even advisable. But internally, involving curators. At MOMA, right before I left, there was the Bruce Conner exhibition, and he has this wax sculpture, the child, that was made out of casting wax, which, if you're familiar with it, it's very, very soft, and the sculpture just kind of melted over the course of decades. And they were proposing a reconstruction, and it was a radical proposal, but after bringing several museums together, in fact, involving conservators and curators and the artist's estate, it was decided that it was possible. So that kind of collaborative decision-making has to be done, because you can't just have the determined conservator who's like, oh, this is technologically possible, so we're going to do it. And Nauman's a great example. I think it was at the Julia Stoshak collection where one of his film works, I saw that he required that they play the sound of the film projector, even though it was being projected with video. So is the artist always right? No. But the artist is the artist. So maybe yes. It's subjective.
I think we still have 3 minutes left if there are any more questions. I think we're shooting there first and then maybe head to...
Thanks. One of the other things that is planned for the Federation Square in the next few years, as well as the renovation of the ACMI space, is the introduction possibly of an Apple store, which is of course quite contentious, but I wondered if you would like to talk about what the possibilities for, say, a collaboration between an institution like ACMI and say, even though it's a commercial retail space, but Apple as a company, and how the collaborations, even just the proximity of, say, a store like that, or the the company to a place like ACMI, looking to digital preservation and so on. How you would understand that working in this area?
Well, I think if Katrina could get a direct line to Tim Cook, that maybe collaboration would be possible. But no, I mean, with a project that my company is working on currently with an institutional client, we're working on trying to negotiate, intellectual property rights around something they're interested in collecting that it was in fact, a platform created by a tech startup. And, it's just it's capitalism. It's, if it's something that doesn't help their bottom line, if it's something that's going to be complicated, and they're going to have their lawyers spend a lot of time on, there's not a lot in it for them. At least that's been the kind of dynamic thus far. And this is also something that, I kind of witnessed in negotiating contracts for the acquisition of video games. It's not that collaboration with the private sector doesn't happen successfully. It can, but with companies at the scale of Apple, historically, there's just been no space for it, unfortunately.
But artists are making works on iPads and using apps that are proprietary linked. And, it's Amanda I'm going to say it wrong, Pagliano from Quag Goma. She has this fantastic paper in the AICCM bulletin from last year, I think, on the acquisition of a iPad artwork that needed to be locked down to a specific iOS. So I'd highly recommend that paper and that discussion.
I just wanted to ask those priests that you showcased before, they've been working for years in New York City in very, very specialised fields. I'm just wondering about how practically one can go forward, in the same way that there's a sort of a collapse of that sort of artisanal expertise in an analogue world. There's just not a big enough market for people to be able to sustain a business and an expertise in other generations. So, I mean, just practically, how can you see that kind of incredible specialisation to maintain those pieces of machinery and technology be genuinely passed down and dispersed?
Well, none of those people started doing what they're doing. They all were working in like post-production houses or, audio engineering or, they all worked in commercial places dealing with this media. And it was kind of a very slow transition, I think, for them in beginning to work in the cultural sector. And, I would also say that they don't just work with museums. All of the people I mentioned, I think with the exception of C.T. Louis, work with, the private sector and other, corporate archives even. Everyone has analog media laying around. But I think that that's potentially one thing to think about, if, like a digital agency, for instance, like a creative agency that has like 20 years of experience. I mean, who could you possibly imagine that would have a better like firsthand knowledge of what it takes to maintain like an iOS app or a web platform? So I think, it's a similar kind of thing. It's just so early days that, those people haven't really, it hasn't really percolated yet. So like my company really relies on like convincing people from that world to collaborate with us so that we can kind of tap into that expertise. And I think as we grow, eventually we'll be able to, hire in engineers who are full-time dedicated to that kind of stuff. But for right now, it's collaborations, project-based, things like that.
Does there almost have to be an apprentice program or something to sort of pass on those sort of older school skills? I mean, how can they practically move into it? There's the new skills that have to be learned, but what about those 1970s, 1980s machines?
The apprenticeship model is what's happening currently, but I'm scared. When I go visit these shops, they're definitely not passing down all the knowledge. things are getting left behind, and B, they're only passing it down to a couple of people. So this is why I think museums are well positioned to, give voice to these people, so that, maybe they won't be distributing the knowledge in full depth. It's not quite, an apprenticeship or a guild system, but I think that there would be opportunity to spread with more breadth to more people. So I have hope in that sense.
And I think we have to stop there. So I'd like to thank Ben for that fantastic talk and discussion session.